The Vel'tharan Imperial Court was designed to make everyone feel small. The ceiling vaulted 300 feet overhead, supported by pillars carved from single crystals that caught light and threw it back in colors that didn't quite exist in human visual spectrum. Thousands of delegates filled the grand hall in precise hierarchical arrangement, proximity to the throne determined by power, influence, and the Byzantine calculations of court protocol. Ethan Vale stood at the very back with the other diplomatic support staff, holding Ambassador Chen's document case and trying to look professional. His role was simple: carry things, stand quietly, don't embarrass humanity. After 3 years as a diplomatic aide, he'd gotten very good at professional invisibility. The ceremony had been proceeding for 2 hours. Various delegations approached the throne, presented credentials, offered elaborate speeches about cooperation and mutual prosperity. Ethan had learned to tune out the diplomatic language while maintaining an attentive expression. Empress Seraphis Vel'thara sat on the throne of stars at the hall's center, elevated so everyone had to look up. She was magnificent in the way that made Ethan understand why some species developed religions around their rulers. Silver-scaled skin, marked with bioluminescent patterns that literally glowed with authority. Long ears swept back and adorned with the crown of infinite reach, a piece of living crystal that grew from the Empress's own biology, marking her as legitimate ruler of 40 systems. Violet eyes that had watched governments rise and fall. She'd been Empress for 9 years. Before that, she'd risen from obscurity to power through combination of brilliance, strategy, and ruthless efficiency. The court whispered about her, how she destroyed corruption, modernized governance, and made the empire stronger while making half the nobility furious. Ethan found her impressive in an abstract way, like appreciating a well-designed ship or an efficient system. Powerful, distant, and completely irrelevant to his life. Human delegation, the court announcer called. Ambassador Chen Meilin of Earth's diplomatic corps. Ambassador Chen stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this 100 times. Ethan followed at the prescribed distance, 3 steps behind, slightly left, maintaining proper escort position. They approached the throne. Ambassador Chen bowed at the correct depth for her rank, began her prepared speech about continued cooperation between humanity and the Vel'tharan Empire. Empress Seraphis's gaze swept across them in routine assessment, the kind of look that had probably evaluated 10,000 delegates without memorable distinction. Then her eyes landed on Ethan. She froze. Her entire body went rigid. The bioluminescent patterns across her scales flickered erratically, something Ethan's diplomatic training identified as extreme emotional disturbance. Her hands gripped the throne's armrests with enough force that he heard crystal creak. Then she shuddered, a visible, involuntary reaction that rippled through her entire frame. The court noticed. Whispers exploded across the chamber like wildfire. Guards shifted positions. Advisors exchanged alarmed glances. Empress Seraphis recovered with the discipline of someone trained to control every micro-expression, but the damage was done. Every noble, advisor, and guard in the Grand Hall had seen their unshakable Empress react like she'd seen a ghost. Ambassador Chen faltered mid-sentence, clearly uncertain whether to continue or acknowledge the unprecedented break in protocol. "Continue," the Empress said, her voice carefully controlled but with an undertone Ethan couldn't identify. Her eyes didn't leave him. The ambassador finished her speech, though Ethan could tell she was improvising, her prepared remarks forgotten in the shock of whatever just happened. When the audience concluded and they were dismissed, Empress Seraphis's gaze followed Ethan across the entire hall. He felt it like physical weight. They'd barely left the throne room when guards intercepted them. Polite, respectful, but absolutely unyielding guards. "Ethan Vale," the lead guard said, "you are requested to remain available for further audience with Her Radiance." Requested in the way that meant you have no choice. Ambassador Chen looked between Ethan and the guards with diplomatic alarm. On what grounds? Her radiance's grounds, which require no justification. The guard's tone was courteous but final. Ethan was escorted, not arrested, but definitely not free, to a waiting chamber decorated in ways that suggested whoever sat here was important. Guards stationed themselves at the exits. Advisors hustled past outside, speaking in rapid Vel'tharan too quick for his translator to process. He'd been sitting there for an hour when Ambassador Chen was allowed to visit briefly. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Nothing. I've never been here before, never met the Empress. I stood in the back and held your document case. She reacted to you specifically. The whole court saw it." Chen paced. "Political analysts are already speculating. Did she recognize you? Have you encountered her before?" "I've never seen her before in my life." Ethan thought hard, trying to remember if he'd ever crossed paths with anyone who might have become an empress. Nothing. This has to be a mistake. Empresses don't make mistakes like that in front of their entire court. Chen looked genuinely worried. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than diplomatic protocol. I'll try to get answers, but..." She gestured at the guards outside. "You're in palace custody now. Be very careful what you say." She left. Ethan sat alone in the ornate chamber, trying to understand how standing quietly in the back of a throne room had somehow placed him at the center of imperial attention. Outside he heard whispers in Vel'tharan, caught fragments through the translator, never seen her react like that. Human nobody, what does he mean to her? Whatever had just happened, it had shaken the most powerful woman in 40 systems. And Ethan had absolutely no idea why. 12 years earlier, Helix 9 had been exactly the kind of border station where people came to disappear. Not luxurious enough for the wealthy, not lawless enough for serious criminals, just rough enough that nobody asked questions. Ethan had worked there as a freight coordinator, organizing cargo shipments, managing manifests, keeping the civilian transport system functional. It was late in his shift, the time when the station's day cycle dimmed and most legitimate businesses closed, when he'd found her in Cargo Bay 7. He'd been doing a final inspection before lockdown, checking for unauthorized items or stowaways. Cargo Bay 7 was supposed to be empty, waiting for a shipment arriving next cycle. Instead, he found a Vel'tharan woman hiding behind storage containers. She was young, maybe mid-20s in human equivalent. Her silver-blue skin was marked with bruises and cuts. Her clothes had been expensive once. He could tell from the fabric quality, but were now torn, stained, and filthy. Her long ears were pressed flat against her head in a position Ethan had learned meant fear or submission. She looked at him with violet eyes filled with terror. "Please," she whispered in heavily accented standard, "please don't call security." Ethan should have called security. It was protocol. Stowaways were a serious issue on border stations. But he'd looked at her, really looked at her, and seen someone desperate enough to hide in a freezing cargo bay, injured badly enough that she was shaking from pain or shock, and frightened enough that his presence alone made her flinch. "Are you hurt?" he asked instead. The question seemed to surprise her. Yes, but please, I need." "Stay here." Ethan made the decision in about 3 seconds. "I'm going to get medical supplies and food. You look half-starved." "Why?" She stared at him. "Why would you help?" "Because you're hurt and hiding in a cargo bay. Seems pretty straightforward." He pulled out his datapad, marked Cargo Bay 7 as maintenance hold to prevent anyone else from checking it. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. Don't let anyone see you." He returned with a medkit he technically wasn't authorized to access and food from the commissary. The woman was still there, looking at him like he might be a hallucination. "What's your name?" Ethan asked while helping her treat the wounds, nothing life-threatening but painful and infected. "Sera." She winced as he applied antibacterial gel. "Just Sera." "Okay, Sera, what are you running from?" "Political persecution." She said it carefully, watching his reaction. "I discovered corruption, evidence that would destroy powerful people. They want me dead." Ethan had heard various versions of that story on Helix 9. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was criminals with delusions. He'd learned that verifying every claim was impossible, so you made judgment calls based on instinct. His instinct said Sera was telling the truth. "How long do you need?" he asked. 3 days, maybe 4. There's a transport to neutral territory if I can reach it. You can stay here. Ethan gestured around the cargo bay. I can mark this bay as undergoing long-term maintenance, keep people out, bring you food and supplies. You would risk that for a stranger. You need help, I can provide it, that's reason enough. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite identify. What's your name? Ethan Vale. Over the next 3 days, Ethan covered for Sera's presence. Brought her food, water, clean clothes he requisitioned under false pretenses. She told him fragments of her story, 4th daughter of a minor noble house, discovered military supply corruption, fled with evidence, hunted by assassins. She asked questions about him too. About Earth, about why a human was working on a rough border station, about his philosophy on helping strangers. Don't you worry I'm lying, she asked on the 2nd day. That I'm dangerous. Maybe. But the alternative is abandoning someone who might genuinely need help. I can live with being wrong about you. Can't live with leaving someone to die when I could have helped. On the 3rd day, he got her onto a transport heading to neutral territory. She stood in the cargo bay entrance looking at him with those violet eyes. Why? She asked again. You risked your job, possibly your life. Why? Because you needed help and I could provide it. That's reason enough. Sera stepped forward and touched his face, palm against his cheek, a gesture that felt significant even though Ethan didn't know its cultural meaning. I will remember this, she said quietly. I will remember you, Ethan Vale. The transport left. Ethan returned to his normal routine. Within a month, he'd moved to a different posting. Within 2 months, he'd mostly forgotten about Sera, just another person he'd helped on a station where people often needed help. He never learned her full name, never knew what happened with her evidence, never imagined she'd become anything more than another refugee he'd assisted during his time on Helix 9. Until 12 years later, when he walked into an imperial throne room and saw those same violet eyes staring at him from the face of the most powerful woman in 40 systems. The private audience chamber was smaller than Ethan expected, intimate rather than imposing, decorated with restraint rather than overwhelming grandeur. He'd been brought here directly from the waiting room, guards flanking him with careful respect rather than hostility. Empress Seraphis Vel'thara entered alone, which apparently shocked the guards enough that they exchanged glances but didn't protest. She wore simpler robes than the ceremonial armor from the throne room, still clearly imperial, but less overwhelming. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Ethan Vale, she said finally. Her voice carried layers of emotion Ethan couldn't parse. Freight coordinator, Helix Station, 12 years ago. Memory crashed into him with visceral force. Sera, you were. I was a dissident fleeing execution. She moved closer, her movements carrying the unconscious authority of someone used to command, but tempered with something more personal. 4th daughter of a minor noble house who discovered corruption in military supply chains. I had evidence that would have destroyed 3 high-ranking officials, but no power to use it safely. They sent assassins, Ethan remembered. You were injured. I fled with nothing but what I wore. Ran for 3 days through border territories. When I reached Helix 9, I was starving, hurt, terrified. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed with colors Ethan's training identified as intense emotion. And you, a human who owed me nothing, helped me survive. Ethan tried to process this. The evidence, you got it to neutral territory, what happened? I did more than reach neutral territory. A complicated smile crossed her face. I leveraged the evidence to destroy my enemies, built alliances with officials who valued integrity over corruption, rose through political ranks by proving I couldn't be bought, intimidated, or killed. She gestured around the imperial chamber. I became Empress because you gave me 3 days to heal and plan. 3 days where someone showed me that strength isn't always obvious. That quiet competence and compassion have value. I just helped someone who needed it. Exactly. She stepped closer. Do you understand how rare that is? Especially in the political world I was born into, every action is calculated. Every gesture has 3 meanings. Every kindness comes with strings. Her voice softened. You asked nothing, expected nothing. Helped because it was the right thing to do. That changed how I understood power. Ethan felt overwhelmed. I didn't create an empress. I gave a refugee some food and a place to hide. You gave me hope when I had none, showed me that genuine decency exists, that people can act from principle rather than calculation. She touched her chest, where her bioluminescent patterns pulsed steadily. Many of my policies, prioritizing civilian welfare over military expansion, building infrastructure, judging officials by character rather than connections, were influenced by 3 days with a human freight coordinator who risked everything for no reason except that it was right. You would have succeeded anyway, Ethan said. You're brilliant, strategic. I would have been different. She said it with absolute certainty. Without those 3 days, I would have been harder, more cynical. Would have survived through ruthlessness rather than principle. You showed me another path. She turned toward a window overlooking the Imperial Gardens. I looked for you. After I consolidated power, I tried to find the human who'd helped me on Helix 9. But you'd moved. Your records scattered across postings. I lost the trail. I went to 3 different stations, then took the diplomatic posting. Ethan's brain was still catching up. You were looking for me. For years to repay the debt. To thank you properly. She paused. To see if the person I remembered was real or idealized memory. Sometimes I wondered if I'd created a story, turned a simple act of kindness into something more meaningful than it was. It was just basic decency. Basic decency is the rarest resource in the universe. She turned back. When you walked into my court today, older but unmistakable, every memory came flooding back with physical force. That's why I reacted. Why I couldn't hide it. Because standing 3 steps behind Ambassador Chen was the person who literally shaped who I became, looking like he had no idea of any of this. I didn't until you shuddered. She almost laughed. I shuddered because seeing you felt like confronting a ghost of who I used to be, reminding me viscerally of being vulnerable, frightened, and saved by someone who wanted nothing in return. Her expression grew serious. The court has noticed. They're speculating wildly. I need to make a decision about how to handle this. What are the options? Officially, I could claim mistaken identity. Say you resemble someone from my past. Political theater to save face. She met his eyes. Or I could tell the truth. Acknowledge that I owe my rise to a human who helped me when I had nothing. That the empress they serve was shaped by the quiet strength of someone they'd consider beneath notice. That sounds politically dangerous. Extremely. She smiled slightly. But you taught me that right action matters more than calculated advantage. So I'm inclined toward truth, regardless of convenience. Ethan thought about this. About the woman he'd helped in a cargo bay who'd become the most powerful ruler in 40 systems. About how a simple choice to be decent had echoed across 12 years. If you tell the truth, he said quietly, some will see it as weakness. Others will try to use me, leverage the connection for political advantage. Yes. And I'll be at the center of imperial politics I have no interest in or understanding of. Yes, Ethan sighed. But lying about it, pretending this connection doesn't exist, that would diminish what it meant. Would make it transactional rather than genuine. Seraphis smiled, genuine warmth breaking through imperial composure. You understand perfectly. Truth it is then, regardless of consequences. You realize this is going to complicate both our lives significantly. I spent 12 years trying to find you. Now that I have, I'm not going to pretend you don't exist to make court politics more comfortable." She extended her hand in what Ethan recognized as a Vel'tharan gesture of respect between equals. "Welcome back into my life, Ethan Vale. Prepare for chaos." He accepted the gesture. "At least this time there aren't assassins." "Don't make promises you can't keep. Imperial court politics are essentially assassination by other means." Despite everything, Ethan laughed. And watching the most powerful woman in 40 systems laugh with him, he realized that maybe some connections transcended time, power, and species. Maybe kindness without calculation really did echo across years and empires, even if it came with imperial-level political complications. The announcement came 3 days later. Empress Seraphis Vel'thara, in a public address broadcast across the empire, told the story of her rise to power. And at its center, she placed a human freight coordinator who'd helped a refugee in a cargo bay 12 years ago. The court's reaction was immediate and divided. Conservative factions saw it as weakness, their empress admitting she owed her position to foreign help. Progressive elements saw it as strength, acknowledging debts and truth rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. Political operatives descended on Ethan like scavengers, offers of positions, wealth, influence, all conditional on leveraging his connection to the empress for their benefit. He turned down every single one. Why? One particularly persistent noble demanded, "You could have power, real power. The empress clearly values you." "That's exactly why I won't accept," Ethan said. "The moment I use this connection for personal gain, it stops being about genuine help and becomes transactional. That destroys what it meant." The noble looked at him like he was insane. Ethan was getting used to that expression. Empress Seraphis summoned him to private audience weekly, not for state business, but for conversation. She asked about his work, his observations of the empire's infrastructure, his thoughts on civilian policies. "You realize I'm not qualified to advise on imperial governance," Ethan said during one session. "You're qualified to tell me the truth without calculating how it affects your position. That's the rarest qualification possible." She was reviewing reports, but her attention was clearly split. "My advisors tell me what they think serves their interests or what they believe I want to hear. You tell me what you actually think." Which is usually, "I have no idea, I coordinate cargo shipments." Even that honesty is valuable. She set down the reports. "Do you know how isolated this position is? I'm surrounded by people constantly, never alone, but simultaneously more lonely than I've ever been because every interaction is performance. Except these. Except these." She smiled slightly. "You know me before the crown, before the power. You saw me at my weakest and chose kindness. That creates a foundation of trust that no amount of political calculation can replicate." They fell into a pattern. Weekly conversations that were partly policy discussion, partly friendship, partly Seraphis being able to talk to someone who'd treat her like a person rather than a position. Ethan maintained his diplomatic aide role, refusing promotion but accepting, grudgingly, quarters closer to the imperial wing and security protocols that acknowledged his unusual status. 6 months after his initial appearance in the throne room, a crisis crystallized the situation. A trade dispute between member worlds threatened to fracture carefully maintained alliances. The advisors were divided, each proposing solutions that served their political interests. Empress Seraphis called an emergency session. Ethan was present, his weird semi-official status now accepted by the court as just how things were. After 2 hours of advisors arguing, Seraphis turned to him. "Ethan, what would you do?" The room went silent. Every advisor stared at the human diplomatic aide who was about to weigh in on imperial policy. "I'd ask what the actual civilians on these worlds want," Ethan said. "Not the trade officials, not the political leadership, the regular people whose lives are affected. Because in my experience, when you strip away political posturing, most people just want reliable infrastructure, fair prices, and to not be used as pawns in power games. That's simplistic, one advisor objected. That's foundational, Seraphis countered. Before we argue about tariffs and trade routes, let's determine what outcome actually serves the people these worlds claim to represent. She looked around the council. Implement civilian surveys, real data from actual residents. We'll base policy on that. The advisor who'd objected looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Your radiance, that's highly unusual. So was helping a refugee without asking what you'd gain. She smiled slightly. I'm comfortable with unusual approaches that prioritize people over politics. Proceed. After the session, walking through palace gardens, Seraphis spoke quietly. They think I've made you some kind of unofficial advisor. Haven't you? I've given you access and asked your opinion. Whether that constitutes advisor is semantic. She paused. Does it bother you? Being seen as having influence over an empress. It terrifies me, Ethan admitted. I'm a freight coordinator who got promoted to diplomatic aide because I'm organized and don't complain. I have no business influencing imperial policy. You have every business providing perspective grounded in reality rather than political calculation. She touched his arm, the gesture of respect. That's what you did in that cargo bay. Saw reality, someone who needed help, and acted on that rather than calculating political advantage. That perspective is precisely what power needs most and gets least. You're giving me too much credit. I'm giving you exactly the credit you've earned by consistently being decent without expecting reward. She looked at the gardens, at the elaborate landscape maintained by armies of staff. Do you know what the most dangerous thing for a ruler is? Isolation from reality. Being surrounded by people who reflect your power back at you without truth. You're my anchor to reality, Ethan. The person who knew me when I had no power, and therefore treats me like a person who happens to have power rather than power that happens to be a person. They walked in comfortable silence until Ethan spoke. The court will never fully accept this. There will always be factions that see me as foreign influence or unearned privilege. Yes, and there will always be pressure to either elevate me formally or remove me entirely. Yes. You're okay with that. I spent 12 years looking for you. Now that I've found you, I'm not letting political convenience dictate whether you remain in my life. She smiled. Besides, you're good for me. Keep me grounded. Remind me why I fought to be Empress in the first place. To build something better, not just hold power. What if I wanted to leave? Go back to less complicated work. Seraphis's expression grew serious. Then I'd let you go. The moment this becomes an obligation rather than a choice, it loses the meaning it had in that cargo bay. She paused. But I hope you'll stay. Not because I command it, because you choose to. Because this friendship, built on a moment of unplanned decency 12 years ago, is worth the complications. Ethan thought about it, about the cargo bay, about the woman he'd helped who'd become an empress, about how a simple choice to be decent had echoed across years and empires in ways he could never have anticipated. I'll stay, he said, but I'm keeping my diplomatic aide job. I like the work. It's straightforward. Unlike everything else about this situation. Deal, she laughed, though I reserve the right to ask your opinion on policy matters. And I reserve the right to say, I have no idea, ask someone qualified. Also acceptable. Months became years. Ethan remained in his position, officially a diplomatic aide, unofficially someone the Empress consulted regularly, and whose presence in imperial circles became normalized. He never sought power, never leveraged the connection, never tried to profit from what had started as simple kindness in a cargo bay. And Empress Seraphis Vel'thara, ruler of 40 systems, commander of fleets, arbiter of the fates of billions, always made time for the human who'd helped her when she had nothing, treating him as the friend he'd become by never asking